I'm Julia Hart, 27, and the day my family gathered to open my grandfather's will, my father slid a leather folder toward my sister and said, "Calm as a clock. Madison gets 11 million. He didn't look at me when he added, "And you, Julia, go earn your own." The room went so still, the air felt heavy, thick with cologne and old carpet, and the faint tick of a wall clock counting my humiliation. A dozen eyes flicked away, like I'd done something rude by existing. I told myself to breathe, to sit up straight, to pretend the sting didn't reach the bone. My mother's smile was tight enough to crack. My sister traced a finger over the embossed cover like she'd known all along. Across the table, the attorney lifted a sealed envelope and said it was from my grandfather, meant to be read only if I was present. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, then tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to stand tall when someone tried to shrink you. I grew up in a small Texas town where summer smelled like cut hay and rain on hot dirt, and where my grandfather Walter kept a jar of loose screws and a notebook of ideas. He never called inventions, just fixes that might help. My world was simple school church potlucks and the kind of thrift that teaches you to wash a Ziploc bag and save string. Ruth, my grandmother, tucked dollar bills into my coat pockets and said, "Kindness is wealth you never spend up," while Walter would sit with me on the porch and ask what I noticed about bees clouds or the way a creek finds its path. When my parents moved us closer to the city, our life got shinier. New cul-de-sac manicured hedges, a dinner table where success came with a dollar sign, and conversation was a scoreboard. I learned 2 languages at once, my grandparents' quiet usefulness and my parents' public polish, and they didn't always translate. At 13, I stopped bringing home the messy projects that made me happy because the compliments went to the polished performances that made other people comfortable. By the time I was old enough to leave for college, I had a tidy smile and a careful way of taking up less space than I needed. I worked campus jobs, stayed up late with lab partners who also drank cheap coffee, and visited Walter and Ruth whenever I could get a bus ticket home. They never asked for proof of progress. They asked if I was sleeping and if my shoes were holding up. Back in the city, the Hart name kept climbing my father's firm on billboards, my mother's photo in charity newsletters, my sister tall and glossy in every frame. Invitations to family dinners started to arrive with dress codes and themes. I'd help in the kitchen and wash my hands until the smell of garlic and lemon chased off the perfume and the pressure. It felt like living between 2 clocks, one that measured time in quarters and promotions, the other in hands held, and a porch swing's slow rhythm. When Walter passed, the news came in a group text with a location and a schedule for the service, nothing about last words or the old hymns he loved. The funeral was tasteful in cool lilies arranged in precise arcs, a slideshow set to licensed music. People I'd never met told me what a pillar my grandfather had been, and then asked what I planned to do next. I stared at a photo of Walter with grease on his knuckles and a grin caught mid-laugh, and felt a homesickness that didn't have a map. Afterward at the reception, Ruth squeezed my hand and murmured thank you for coming, like there had been any question I would. I wanted to ask her if Walter ever finished the sketch of the rainwater barrel he swore could outsmart a drought, but someone pulled her away for a polite photograph. The will reading was held in a paneled conference room high above traffic, a view my father favors because it looks like control. The chairs were soft, the water cold, and the temperature set just below comfortable, a trick my mother says keeps people from getting sleepy or sentimental. Madison wore a bracelet that caught the light whenever she moved her wrist, and every glint felt like punctuation. When my father announced the gift to her and the nothing to me, there were no gasps, only a quiet shuffling of acceptance, as if the outcome were obvious, as if I'd wandered into the last act of a play I hadn't been allowed to audition for. I folded my hands in my lap to keep them from shaking, and pictured Walter's porch, the chipped paint, the bowl of washers, the pencil stuck behind his ear. Martin Blake cleared his throat and said he had one item to address on Walter's behalf. He held up a sealed envelope and explained that Walter had insisted it only be opened with me in the room, that it belonged to me, even if its words were meant for everyone. The seal was the old-fashioned kind, pressed deep with an H, and for a second I could see my grandfather's hands steady and practical, not a man for ceremony, unless it mattered. My mother's smile faltered. My sister stopped moving her wrist. My father leaned back as if distance might soften whatever was coming. I watched the blade slide under the paper, heard the hush of the envelope give, and felt the first tremor of something I couldn't yet name, like the moment before thunder reaches the field. When Martin Blake unfolded the letter, I felt every sound fade, the hum of the air vent, the shuffle of papers, even my own heartbeat. His voice was low and deliberate as he began reading Walter's words. The room leaned toward him, drawn by something more powerful than money. To my granddaughter Julia, he said, "If this letter is being read, then I am no longer there to tell you what you always deserved to hear." My breath caught. His words spilled like a quiet tide, remembering my experiments on the porch, how I saw the world through questions instead of answers, how he admired that about me. He wrote that I wasn't invisible, not even when others made me feel that way, and that he was leaving something built from faith in what I could become. Martin paused to steady his hand as he reached the next lines, but I could still see the faint smile in his eyes, like he understood the weight of the message. To my granddaughter, Julia Hart, he continued, "I leave the Pine Ridge Research Annex with its laboratory equipment and funding for ongoing development. It belongs to you as both a responsibility and a beginning." The words struck the air with the clarity of glass breaking. My father's jaw tensed. My mother's hands knotted together in her lap. Madison shifted sharply in her chair, the sparkle in her bracelet catching the light like a flash of fire. Before I could even process what I'd heard, she exploded. "That's ridiculous," she snapped, rising halfway from her seat. "The lab was supposed to go to me. I was the one who visited him. I was the one who cared." Her voice climbed, cracking with disbelief. My mother murmured her name, trying to soothe her, but Madison wasn't listening. "He wouldn't have done that," she said, turning on Martin like he'd forged the will himself. My father leaned back, his tone measured but icy. "We'll have this reviewed," he said, his voice cutting through the air like the edge of a blade. "This can't be right." Martin didn't flinch. He simply folded his glasses, resting them on the table beside the letter. "Mr. Hart," he said calmly, "your father's wishes are clear. Everything was documented, witnessed, and notarized." The silence that followed was heavy. My mother exhaled slowly, smoothing her skirt. "Maybe there's been some misunderstanding," she began, her tone sweet but thin. Madison spent months taking care of Walter. Julia was hardly around. I sat still, my palms pressed against my knees, fighting the trembling that threatened to give me away. But then Martin unfolded one more sheet of paper, smaller, yellowed at the edges. "There's one more note," he said quietly. "Your grandfather asked that it be read aloud." My mother's hand froze mid-gesture. My father's face went blank. Madison crossed her arms tightly, a wall of defiance across her chest. I could feel every eye turned toward me, as if I'd summoned this myself. Martin's voice softened. To my family, he read, "I want to set the record straight. Julia's absence was never her choice. She was kept away." My mother's color drained instantly. The air shifted. Even the sound of the city outside seemed to stop. "She was told her grandparents were moved to a facility that didn't exist," Martin continued. "She was given a false phone number. She was lied to." A single tear slid down Ruth's cheek, her hand covering her mouth. My father stood abruptly. "That's enough," he barked. But Martin didn't stop. Walter wrote this himself. He wanted the truth to outlive him. I couldn't move. Every lie I'd been fed about distance, about missed visits, about how I'd supposedly drifted away, it was all unraveling thread by thread in front of the very people who had spun it. My mother tried to speak, but her voice broke. "We thought it was for the best." She stammered her words, desperate, brittle. "You needed space, Julia. You were difficult." Madison stared at the table, her nails pressing half moons into the wood. My father's expression hardened, a practiced calm, barely holding. "This is an old man's confusion," he said flatly. "We shouldn't let sentiment rewrite history." That's when my grandmother's voice cut through the room, steady and strong despite the years. "No," Ruth said, standing with both hands braced on the table. Walter was never confused. "You did this, Daniel. You and Elaine." Her gaze flicked toward Madison, then softened, sorrow passing through it. "And you let them." The room fractured under her words. My father's face twisted in anger he couldn't contain. "Mother, this isn't the time!" But Ruth didn't stop. "You stole her from us," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "You let him die believing Julia didn't care." My chest burned, but I stayed silent. The truth had taken its own shape now, bigger than any defense or apology. My mother finally snapped, her voice sharp with pride and fear. "We did what parents have to do. Julia was ungrateful, always chasing things that didn't matter. Walter indulged her. We needed boundaries." She glanced at Madison as if expecting support. But Madison's lips parted and no sound came. Ruth turned toward me. "He asked for you every day," she whispered. "He left this world waiting for your voice." It felt like something inside me cracked open. For years, I'd thought I was the one who'd failed him, that my silence had cost me the man who saw me best. Now every moment of guilt I'd carried dissolved into something deeper, heavier, the knowledge that my parents had chosen deceit over love. Ruth straightened her chin high, her grief hardening into resolve. "We're done hiding," she said firmly. "Everyone will know what really happened." My father's composure snapped. "That's enough," he thundered, his fist hitting the table. "We will not have this discussion here." The sound echoed through the room. My mother reached for him, whispering something I couldn't hear. Madison stood in the corner, her hands trembling, eyes glistening with confusion. Martin gathered the papers and slipped them back into his briefcase. "Mr. Hart," he said evenly, "I've witnessed many families lose their way over inheritance. But this one lost far more before the will was ever written." For a long time no one moved. My father adjusted his tie, his eyes darting to the door. "We're leaving," he said, his voice low. My mother followed without looking back. Madison lingered for a moment, her face caught between anger and shame. I didn't know she whispered so quietly it barely reached me. Then she turned and walked out. When the door closed, the room felt hollow. The echo of their footsteps faded, leaving only the steady tick of the clock and Ruth's uneven breathing. I walked to her, unsure if I should speak. She took my hand, her fingers cool but sure. "He built that lab for you," she said softly. "He wanted you to have what he never could, a place where curiosity isn't punished." My throat tightened, but I nodded. Outside, the afternoon light cut through the blinds in pale stripes, dust hanging in the stillness like a confession suspended in air. Martin gathered his things quietly, then paused at the door. "Your grandfather believed in you, Julia. Don't let them take that from you now." His words lingered after he left, more blessing than advice. Ruth and I stayed long after everyone else had gone. The will and its truths spread out across the table like pieces of a broken map. Neither of us spoke much. There wasn't anything left to explain. When we finally stepped outside, the sky was turning a deep, tired blue. The car my parents had arrived in was gone, its tire marks fading into the gravel drive. Ruth looked toward the horizon, then back at me. "They'll come back," she said quietly. "People like that always do." I didn't answer, but I knew she was right. That night back at the ranch house, the porch light flickered against the wind. Ruth sat in her old chair while I stood at the railing, the boards creaking under my feet. The air smelled like rain and cedar. Inside, the phone rang once, then stopped. Neither of us moved to answer it. We didn't need to. Whatever was coming next would find us soon enough. The next morning, the ranch was quiet, except for the faint hum of the wind through the fields. Ruth had fallen asleep in her chair, a blanket pulled to her chin, the old rotary phone resting silent beside her. I sat on the porch steps, wrapped in my jacket, staring at the horizon that glowed pale gold. It should have been peaceful, but my thoughts kept circling back to the letter, to the way my father's voice cracked when the truth broke through his lies. There was no sense of triumph in it, only a hollow ache that settled deep in my chest. I wanted to believe that everything was finished, but Ruth's warning echoed in my mind they'd come back. People like that always did. By noon, the sky had turned sharp blue, the kind that makes every shadow crisp. I made coffee for both of us, the smell filling the kitchen like it used to when Walter was alive. Ruth stirred her cup slowly, watching the steam rise. "You should go out there," she said, finally nodding toward the dirt road that led to the back acreage. "See what he left you, the Pine Ridge Annex, the lab." The words still felt unreal. I'd spent years thinking Walter's projects were little more than sketches in his notebook, never realizing he'd built an entire facility on that land. I hesitated, but Ruth's eyes told me not to argue. The drive out was short but strange, passing landmarks that had once felt like childhood and now looked like clues. The creek where Walter taught me to skip stones was smaller than I remembered. The cedar trees along the fence line were taller, almost guarding what lay beyond. When I turned the corner, I saw it a low, modern building with glass walls and a steel roof gleaming against the rust-colored fields. It looked completely out of place, and yet perfectly his. I parked beside the gate and stood for a long moment, just listening to the hum of the wind against the glass. Inside, the air smelled faintly of sawdust and old paper. Sunlight poured across metal tables lined with microscopes, soil samples, and equipment labeled in Walter's unmistakable handwriting. On one wall, a whiteboard still held his last notes, scribbles about seed hydration and energy efficiency. I ran my fingers over the marker lines like they were sacred text. A folder sat open on the central table with my name written in blue ink. My heart pounded as I flipped through it. Inside were funding documents, partnership letters, and a map of the property labeled Phase 2 Expansion. My grandfather hadn't just dreamed this up. He'd built the foundation for something far bigger. I heard the crunch of tires outside before I could gather my thoughts. A black SUV rolled up the driveway, dust trailing behind it. The sound of the door slamming made my stomach drop. My father's voice carried across the field, sharp and clipped. "Julia, we need to talk." Ruth had been right. They hadn't waited long. I met him at the doorway, sunlight cutting between us. He looked smaller somehow, though he tried to mask it behind his usual authority. My mother followed sunglasses covering her eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line. Madison trailed behind them, quieter than I'd ever seen her. "This is private property," I said quietly. "You shouldn't be here." My father scoffed, brushing past me into the lab. "Private," he said. "Everything here was built with family money. Don't fool yourself into thinking this belongs solely to you." He started opening drawers, inspecting files, as if looking for proof that he still had control. My mother stood by the doorway, her eyes darting around like the sight of it all unsettled her. "You can't possibly manage something like this," she said softly. "It's too much responsibility for one person. Let us help." I knew what help meant. It meant control the same kind that had turned every gift into a leash. I took a step closer, my voice steady. "You had your chance to be part of this family's work. You chose to shut me out. This is Walter's legacy, not a business opportunity." My father turned to face me, anger flashing behind his calm expression. "You don't understand how the world works, Julia. That lab could be worth millions. You think you can protect it alone?" His tone wasn't concern. It was warning. Before I could answer, Ruth's car pulled up behind them. She stepped out small but unshakable, her presence cutting through the tension like a blade. "You are trespassing," she said, her voice firm. "I told you not to come back here." My father started to argue, but she raised her hand and he fell silent. "You deceived your father," once she continued, her words low and deliberate. "You won't do it again. Julia is the rightful heir. If you contest, that you'll answer to the courts and to me." The silence that followed was heavy. My mother turned away, blinking hard. Madison's eyes filled with tears she didn't wipe away. Ruth walked past them, laying a hand on my arm as she stepped inside the lab. "He built this for you," she said softly. "Don't let their noise drown out what it means." My throat tightened, but I nodded. My father's expression hardened. He straightened his jacket and motioned to my mother. "We're leaving," he said coldly. As they turned to go, he stopped at the door and glanced back at me. "You'll regret this." The words hung in the air long after the sound of their car faded down the road. That evening, Ruth and I sat outside the lab, watching the sky shift from gold to deep violet. The lights from the building glowed faintly against the fields, reflecting off the glass walls like lanterns in the dark. She spoke quietly, almost to herself. "Your grandfather always said truth outlives pride. You just saw it happen. I didn't know what to say, so I listened to the crickets, to the hum of the new world he'd left behind for me to tend." Over the next few days, I sorted through Walter's records, piecing together the scope of his work. He'd collaborated with universities, local farmers, and even environmental programs overseas. His notes were precise, but full of warmth, full of belief in the people he worked with. I found an envelope addressed to me in his handwriting. Inside was a single sentence: "The world needs your questions, not their answers." I sat with it for a long time, the words as steady as his old voice. Late one afternoon, I drove back to the ranch to check on Ruth. The house was dim, the evening light spilling through the curtains. She was sitting by the window, a stack of letters in her lap. "They called," she said quietly. "Your parents." My pulse quickened, but her tone stayed calm. "They want a meeting. Here. Tonight." I hesitated, glancing toward the phone. "Do you want me to say no?" She shook her head. "No. Let them come. It's time to close this chapter for good." When their car pulled up just after sunset, Ruth was already waiting on the porch. The porch light glowed behind her, outlining her like a sentinel. I stayed inside at first, listening to the muffled voices through the screen door. My mother spoke first, her tone careful, almost pleading. "We made mistakes, but we're still family." My father's voice followed, smoother, practiced. "Let's be reasonable, Mother. You can't cut us out of our own heritage." Ruth's reply was quiet but sharp. "Heritage isn't theft, Daniel. You stole her chance to say goodbye to her grandfather. You stole years you can't give back. You'll leave what remains alone." My father tried to interject, but Ruth's voice rose clear and strong as I'd ever heard it. "Get off this porch. You've done enough harm here." I opened the door, then stepping into the light. My parents turned toward me. My mother's expression faltered. My father's mouth tightened. "You heard her," I said. "Go." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Madison stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," she said, "for all of it." She looked at me, her eyes glassy. I didn't know how to stop them. I nodded, unable to speak. My father's eyes flicked between us, full of something I couldn't name, anger maybe, or the first sting of guilt. But Ruth's voice ended it. "You're done here," she said. "Leave this house and don't come back." When their car finally disappeared down the road, the night fell utterly still. The air smelled like wet soil and cedar, just as it had that first summer I learned how to measure rainfall in jars. Ruth exhaled her shoulders, relaxing for the first time in days. "It's over," she murmured. I watched the dark fields stretching out past the porch, and for the first time since the will reading, I believed her, though part of me knew that endings like storms rarely hold for long. The days that followed felt suspended, as if the world was holding its breath after a long storm. Ruth moved slowly through the house, her steps steady but quiet, while I split my time between the ranch and the lab. I tried to keep busy cataloging Walter's notes, meeting the small team of researchers who'd once worked with him, learning what had been left undone. Yet beneath every new discovery ran the same quiet current of unease. I'd finally seen my parents' deceit laid bare, but the truth didn't close the wound. It only showed how deep it went. Ruth spent most mornings on the porch with her tea, watching the fields. One afternoon, as I passed her with a stack of folders, she said, "He would have been proud of how you handled them." I stopped at the doorway, unsure what to say. Pride was something I'd stopped reaching for years ago, but there was warmth in her voice, the kind that steadied more than it praised. She nodded toward the road. "They'll stay away a while. Let them." In the weeks that followed, letters began to arrive, official documents from Martin Blake's office finalizing Walter's estate, confirming my ownership of the Pine Ridge Annex, and listing the assets attached to it. The weight of it was overwhelming, yet I couldn't shake the sense that I'd only inherited half of what Walter intended. The property was more than land and buildings. It was a question he'd asked me to answer in my own way. Every time I unlocked the lab doors, I felt his absence like air pressure filling every room he once worked in. One morning, I found a handwritten list taped to the inside of a cabinet door. It was Walter's neat script, a series of reminders. Trust your hands. Keep the soil alive. Share what you learn. The simplicity of it caught in my throat. He'd built this place not just for research, but for purpose. I decided to keep the staff on, promising them continuity and funding. Their relief was quiet but genuine. Among them was a woman in her 40s named Tara Johnson, who'd managed Walter's agricultural studies, and a younger man named Micah Lee, who had worked on renewable irrigation systems. They'd both known me as a child, though I barely remembered them. "He never stopped talking about you," Tara said, as we toured the greenhouse together. "Every experiment, every note he'd say, 'Julia will see this through.'" Her words stayed with me as I drove home that evening. The ranch looked smaller from the road, dwarfed by the vast fields behind it. Inside, Ruth had set the table with 2 plates and a casserole that smelled like rosemary and butter. We ate in silence until she set her fork down. "I've been thinking," she set her eyes on her plate. "You shouldn't carry this alone. Walter always meant for it to grow beyond one pair of hands." She reached into her cardigan and pulled out a small envelope. "He wrote this for you. I kept it until things settled." The paper inside was creased and faintly yellowed, written in the same steady handwriting. "Legacy doesn't begin with ownership," it read. "It begins with trust. Find people who care about the work, not the credit." Beneath it was a sketch of a larger campus, multiple buildings labeled Research, Education, and Community. My breath caught. He hadn't just imagined expansion, he'd mapped it. Ruth's gaze softened. "He called it his second harvest," she said quietly. "He believed the next generation would finish what he started." That night I lay awake replaying his words. The house creaked in the wind, and through the open window I could hear coyotes in the distance. Somewhere between their calls, I decided what I had to do. By morning, I'd called Martin's office to start the process of reestablishing partnerships, reaching out to local schools and agricultural networks Walter had once worked with. When Tara and Micah came into the lab that week, I told them I wanted to expand. Their faces lit up with something close to relief. "Then let's get started," Tara said. "We still have his old grant proposals. Some are half finished, but they're good." The days became fuller. We spent long hours cleaning, sorting, and rebuilding. The hum of machinery returned, joined by laughter echoing down the corridors. We revived Walter's experiments with drought-resistant crops, testing seeds that could thrive in dry soil. At night, I'd walk the property feeling the steady rhythm of progress under my feet. For the first time in years, my work felt connected to something larger than survival. But peace has a way of drawing shadows back. It started with an envelope left on the lab's front steps. No return address, just my name written in my father's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a legal notice challenging the transfer of assets. I stared at it for a long time, the words blurring together. When I showed Ruth, she only sighed. "He can't stand losing control," she said, folding the paper neatly before setting it aside. "Don't let him drag you into another storm." Still, the days that followed were uneasy. Every car that passed the gate made my stomach tighten. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I saw a familiar SUV idling by the road. It didn't move when I stepped outside, just lingered long enough for me to recognize the license plate. Then it turned and disappeared down the hill. I didn't tell Ruth. I didn't have to. She already sensed it. The next morning, Martin called. "Don't worry," he said calmly. "I've already filed a response. He doesn't have a case. Your grandfather's documentation is airtight." I thanked him, though my voice came out thinner than I intended. That night, Ruth found me in the kitchen, staring at the phone again. She placed her hand on mine. "They can't take away what's been earned," she said softly. "They can only try to make you doubt it." Weeks passed without further word. The legal notice faded into background noise, replaced by the steady rhythm of work. The lab's first trial crops sprouted early, their green shoots bending under sunlight. Tara brought coffee every morning, Micah played music through the intercom, and the team started calling the lab the annex like Walter had. Each success felt like stitching something back together, something my family had tried to tear apart. Then one evening, just as I was closing up, the front door creaked open. A voice called my name, familiar, yet uncertain. Madison stood in the doorway, her hands clasped together, eyes darting across the lab. She looked different, tired, smaller, without the usual polish. "I heard what you're building," she said quietly. "I just wanted to see it for myself." For a moment I couldn't move. The years of bitterness and betrayal pressed down, but then I remembered Ruth's words about trust and second chances. I motioned for her to come in. She walked slowly, her heels clicking against the tile, stopping at one of the greenhouse windows where rows of seedlings swayed in the filtered light. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "He'd be proud." I studied her face, the one that used to smirk when my father praised her, and saw no trace of it now. "I didn't know how much he gave you," she said, "or why. I thought he loved us both the same." I kept my voice steady. "He did. He just saw us differently." Madison nodded, her eyes glistening. "I'm sorry," she said, the words trembling out, "for lying to you, for keeping you away. I thought I was protecting what he wanted, but I was protecting what Dad wanted." The silence that followed felt fragile, balanced on a thread. I didn't know if forgiveness was possible, but the sincerity in her voice was something new. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," she added. "I just wanted you to hear it." When she left, I stayed by the window long after her car disappeared. Outside, the fields glowed under the moonlight, rows of young plants reaching upward. Behind me, the lab lights reflected in the glass, blending my reflection with theirs. The wind outside was gentle, carrying the scent of soil and something faintly sweet, like the promise of rain. That night, I returned to the ranch to find Ruth waiting by the door. "She came, didn't she?" she asked. I nodded. "Good," she said simply. "Maybe something can grow from that, too." She handed me a mug of tea and motioned toward the porch. "Sit a while. You've earned a quiet night." I sat beside her, listening to the crickets and the far-off hum of the highway. The stars stretched wide over us, bright and endless. For the first time, I felt the weight of what Walter had left, not as a burden, but as an inheritance of purpose. Somewhere in the darkness, the future was taking shape slow and steady, as the crops outside waiting for dawn to show what would come next. Madison's visit lingered in my mind long after her car disappeared into the dark. The words she'd spoken, quiet, unsure, almost trembling, followed me back to the ranch that night. Ruth had already turned in, and the house was still, save for the soft ticking of the hallway clock. I stood by the kitchen window, watching the reflection of the porch light flicker on the glass. Somewhere out in the fields, a night bird called once, then went silent. I didn't sleep. Instead, I replayed that conversation again and again, trying to understand what had changed in her, or if anything truly had. The next morning brought a thin gray light that turned the field silver. Ruth was at the table with her cup of tea when I came downstairs. She looked up briefly and said, "You're up early." I poured coffee and sat across from her, waiting for her to say what she already knew. "She'll come again," Ruth said, finally stirring her tea. "The door she opened last night won't stay shut." She wasn't angry, only certain. Then she reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "Let it happen on your terms." At the lab, the day began quietly. Tara was already in the greenhouse making notes by the irrigation tanks. Micah was bent over a laptop troubleshooting a software update. Outside, the air smelled of wet soil and fertilizer, sharp but clean. The team moved with the easy rhythm that comes after months of working side by side. There was something almost comforting in that sound, the steady hum of purpose. But even in that calm, I could sense a new chapter forming, something shifting beneath the routine. Later that week, I received an email from the State Agriculture Board inviting us to present at a Regional Innovation Summit in Dallas. It was a chance to showcase our research to private donors and local farms. Walter's old contacts had mentioned us in their reports, and now the invitation bore my name. The thought of standing on a stage under bright lights made my stomach twist, but Tara's excitement was contagious. "This is the kind of visibility he dreamed about," she said. "You have to go." The following days were a blur of preparation. We packed soil samples charts and a short video presentation about our community partnerships. I wrote and rewrote my speech until the words felt like my own. The night before the event, I found Ruth sitting on the porch, the sky behind her painted in deep oranges and fading blue. She looked up as I joined her. "You'll do fine," she said, as if she'd read my thoughts. "He'd be proud." Her tone was calm, but her eyes were bright. "Just tell the truth. It's always enough." The conference hall in Dallas was vast rows of booths, polished floors, the buzz of microphones and introductions. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped up to the podium, my hands trembling slightly. The lights made it hard to see past the first few rows. But I found my rhythm talking about Walter's vision, the drought-resistant crops, and our small victories in local communities. I spoke of the children who'd visited the lab last summer, the ones who'd brought their notebooks filled with questions. By the time I finished, the applause felt like a wave. I wasn't sure I was ready to stand in, but I did. Afterward, people came by our booth with questions, business cards, and promises to connect. Amid the crowd, a man approached me with a quiet smile. "Julia Hart," he said, shaking my hand. "I'm David Rains from the National Agricultural Foundation. We've been following your work." He handed me a card. "We're launching a grant program for sustainable research initiatives. I think your center would be a perfect fit." That evening, back in my hotel room, I laid the card on the table and just stared at it. It felt like one of those moments Walter used to describe, the kind that started small but could change the shape of everything after it. I called Ruth to tell her, and her voice came through the line, warm and steady. "He planted more than one kind of seed, Julia," she said. "Looks like they're all starting to bloom." When I returned to Pine Ridge a few days later, Ruth was waiting by the porch, waving a letter in her hand. "You've got mail," she said, handing it to me with a knowing smile. It was from Madison. The envelope was simple, her handwriting small and careful. Inside was a short note. "Thank you for letting me see the lab. I didn't expect forgiveness. I just needed to understand. I'd like to help with the children's program if you'll allow it. M." I sat with the letter for a long time before answering. My reply was just one line. "You can come Saturday morning. We start early." When the day came, she arrived in jeans and an old sweatshirt, her hair tied back, no jewelry, no pretense. The children's group had already gathered by the greenhouse, their laughter carrying on the wind. Madison stood beside me, uncertain at first, then slowly joining in as the kids crowded around the planting beds. Watching her kneel beside them, teaching them how to pat the soil gently around a seedling, I felt something loosen in my chest. At lunchtime, the group dispersed, leaving us alone under the shade of the awning. She turned to me, brushing dirt from her hands. "You built something real here," she said, "something that doesn't need a stage or a spotlight." Her tone wasn't jealous, it was grateful. I nodded, unsure how to respond. She hesitated, then added, "I've been volunteering at a literacy center downtown. Maybe I could help the kids here with presentation skills or storytelling. Something small, I repeated, and we both smiled a little. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first thread of something steadier than apology. The weeks rolled forward in quiet progress. The lab expanded into a second wing funded partly by the grant David Rains had mentioned. Farmers from nearby counties started visiting more often, curious about our methods. Tara and Micah led workshops, and the team grew. Sometimes I'd catch Ruth standing at the edge of the field, watching it all with the same proud half-smile Walter once wore. But one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found her sitting on the porch, holding a small velvet pouch. Her expression was distant. "I found this in Walter's desk," she said softly, handing it to me. Inside was an old silver pocket watch, its surface worn smooth. The initials WH were engraved faintly on the back. When I opened it, a tiny photograph slipped out, a younger version of me standing beside Walter at my first science fair. On the edge of the photo, in his handwriting, were the words, "My little scientist will change the world someday." The sight of it blurred my vision. Ruth reached over and closed the watch gently in my palm. "He carried it every day," she said it reminded him that time doesn't wait, but purpose endures. I couldn't speak. The only sound was the faint rustle of the wind through the trees, like the echo of his laugh drifting across the fields. That night, after Ruth went to bed, I walked out to the bench near the edge of the property. The stars were out, scattered across a deep blue sky. I held the pocket watch up to the light of the moon, the silver glinting softly. For a moment, it felt like he was right there beside me. The house behind me glowed faintly through the trees, and somewhere in the dark, the faint hum of the lab reached my ears. I whispered to the night, to the man who had believed in me when no one else did. "You were right," I said quietly. "They tried to make me smaller, but I grew anyway." The wind stirred again, gentle and cool, carrying the scent of wildflowers from the field. I closed the watch and slipped it into my pocket, the weight of it both grounding and light. The future stretched out before me, unfinished, wide, and full of promise. And though I couldn't see it yet, I knew that what began as one man's faith in a forgotten granddaughter was now a legacy rooted deep enough to outlast us all. The months after I found Walter's pocket watch felt like a quiet turning of seasons. The fields brightened with spring, the greenhouses thrived, and the hum of work filled each morning with new purpose. Ruth spent more time resting her chair, now stationed by the window facing the east pasture. Every sunrise seemed to reach for her first, the light spilling across her lap as she read the newspaper or sorted through old photographs. She said it helped her keep time with the world outside, though I knew she was watching the years more than the headlines. At the lab, the pace quickened. Our first grant funding arrived in April, followed by 2 more before summer. Tara expanded the education wing into weekend workshops for high school students, and Micah supervised the installation of a new irrigation system that would cut our water use in half. Each milestone brought a mix of pride and disbelief. Walter's vision wasn't just holding it, was growing roots we hadn't even seen yet. One evening after the team left for the day, I lingered in the main building watching the sun sink behind the glass walls. The lab's lights reflected across the fields like quiet lanterns. I walked through the corridors, stopping at the framed photo of Walter that hung in the lobby. His eyes held that same familiar twinkle, patient, unassuming, but certain. I whispered softly, "We're getting there." That same week, I received a letter from the State University's research department inviting me to collaborate on a climate resilience study. They'd heard about Pine Ridge's success and wanted to partner. The offer felt monumental validation, not only of the work, but of the man who dreamed it first. I brought the news to Ruth that evening, her face lighting with quiet pride. "He'd call that your first real harvest," she said, squeezing my hand. The following days were full of preparation. I arranged a meeting with the university team and spent late nights reviewing proposals, drafting plans, and building presentations. I didn't notice how often Ruth had begun to tire or how long her pauses grew between breaths. It wasn't until one afternoon when I came home early and found her asleep on the porch that I realized how frail she'd become. The cup of tea beside her had gone cold, her book resting open on her lap. I sat down next to her and listened to the shallow rhythm of her breathing, a sound both fragile and familiar. When she woke, she smiled faintly. "I was dreaming of the orchard," she said, her voice soft. "Your grandfather was there planting something new." Her eyes drifted toward the horizon, and for a moment she looked younger, her face lit by memory instead of time. "Promise me you'll keep planting, Julia, even when it's hard, even when the soil feels empty." I promised. She nodded, satisfied, then closed her eyes again, the wind lifting strands of her silver hair. By summer's end, Ruth's health declined quickly. The doctor visited weekly, his tone gentle but final. We moved her bed near the large window so she could see the fields from where she rested. Madison came often quiet and careful, helping with meals and reading aloud when Ruth's eyesight grew dim. The distance that had once divided us began to shrink in those days, not through apologies, but through shared silence. We worked side by side, speaking little, finding comfort in the same small gestures, straightening a blanket, refilling a cup, opening the curtains at sunrise. One evening, while the sky blazed orange over the fields, Ruth asked for her wedding ring. I fetched it from the drawer beside her bed and slipped it gently onto her finger. She turned it in the fading light and smiled. "He gave me this the same day he bought the first acre of land. Said it was a promise we'd build something that lasted." Her voice caught. "You've done that, Julia. You've kept the promise." I stayed beside her until the stars came out, her hand cool but steady in mine. She passed away a week later on a clear September morning. Madison and I were both there. The nurse opened the window so the breeze could move through the room. The sound of rustling leaves filled the space where words wouldn't come. Afterward, I walked to the edge of the field and stood among the rows of young crops, their green blades trembling in the wind. It felt like she was there, too, woven into the land, quiet, but enduring. The funeral was simple, held beneath the oak tree behind the ranch house. Friends, neighbors, and the team from Pine Ridge came to pay their respects. I read a passage from Walter's old notebook, one he'd written decades earlier. "To plant is to believe in tomorrow, even when you won't see it bloom." The words wavered on my lips, but I managed to finish. Madison stood beside me, her hand gripping mine. In the weeks that followed, the house felt too large. The silence inside it had weight. Every room carried a trace of Ruth, the faint smell of lavender, the folded blanket on the chair, the teacup she'd left on the porch rail. I returned to the lab earlier each morning, finding solace in the noise of progress. Yet some nights, when the lights dimmed and the machines went quiet, I'd catch myself turning toward the window, expecting to see her figure on the porch, waiting with that steady half-smile. It was during one of those late evenings that I received a letter in the mail. The envelope was small, the handwriting familiar. It was from Madison. Inside was a note and a photograph, Ruth sitting between us on the porch last spring, her hands resting on ours. The note read, "She left me her recipe box. Inside, under the dividers, I found a letter addressed to you. You should read it." The next morning, Madison drove out and handed me the envelope. Her eyes were red, but her voice was calm. "I didn't open it," she said. "It felt like something meant only for you." I thanked her and waited until I was alone to unfold the letter. Ruth's handwriting was shaky but clear. "My dearest Julia, it began by the time you read this, the house will be quieter. Don't let that quiet fool you. It's not emptiness. It's peace, the kind that follows storms. You were the one who brought it back. Walter believed in you because you saw things others couldn't. Don't stop now. The world needs people who build without expecting applause. Keep this home alive, not just with work, but with love. That's what lasts." I read it 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in the pocket watch case beside Walter's note. The 2 letters fit perfectly, one legacy resting beside the other. That evening I walked to the far edge of the property where the land sloped down toward the river. The sun was setting low, painting the water gold. The air smelled of clover and damp soil. I could almost hear their voices, the soft cadence of Ruth's laughter, the steady hum of Walter's advice. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I'll keep planting." The wind answered with a rustle through the grass, gentle and familiar. Behind me, the lights from the lab glowed in the fading light, the reflection shimmering like a promise renewed. The world they'd built, the one they'd trusted me to carry forward, was still alive. And though grief sat heavy in my chest, I felt something else take its place too, the steady rhythm of continuity, a heartbeat that belonged to all of us. When I returned to the house, Madison was waiting on the porch, 2 mugs of coffee beside her. She looked up and smiled faintly. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, taking the seat next to her. We sat in silence, watching the stars come out one by one. The air between us felt lighter than it had in years. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The sound carried across the fields, fading into the night. Madison leaned back, her voice low. "She'd like this," she said. I glanced toward the horizon, the dark outline of the field stretching far beyond what the eye could see. "She would," I replied. The night deepened around us, but for the first time it didn't feel lonely. It felt like something had come full circle, like the land itself was breathing again, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. The following spring arrived with a gentleness I hadn't expected. The land had healed from the long winter, and so had I, in small, steady ways. The first bloom of the season stretched across the pastures like a quiet blessing, the kind Ruth would have called a soft beginning. The lab was busier than ever, and yet the house still held her presence, the faint scent of lavender, the careful order she left behind the sound of her voice that lingered in my mind when I least expected it. Madison had taken to visiting every weekend. She would drive out early on Saturday mornings sometimes with baked bread or cuttings from her garden. There was still a carefulness between us, but it was no longer distance, it was respect. On those mornings we'd sit on the porch with coffee, watching the light crawl across the fields. "It's strange," she said once, her tone quiet. "All those years we spent fighting for his approval, and it turns out everything he built was meant for both of us." I looked toward the horizon, where the lab's glass roof caught the sunrise. "Maybe it still is," I said. The children's summer program returned in June, fuller than before. We had 30 students this year, bright, curious faces from neighboring counties, some from hours away. Tara and Micah worked tirelessly to expand the curriculum, and Madison volunteered to help the older kids develop their final presentations. Watching her guide them patient and unguarded, I saw glimpses of the sister I'd always wanted, but never knew how to reach. One afternoon, after the students left, she lingered in the greenhouse doorway, her fingers tracing the leaves of a young citrus tree. "I didn't think I'd ever find something worth showing up for again," she said. "Thank you for letting me try." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. The silence between us carried more truth than words could. By midsummer, Pine Ridge had become something larger than I ever imagined. We hosted open tours for local farmers, partnered with nearby schools, and began shipping our first batches of seed samples across state lines. The air buzzed with a sense of new beginnings. Every wall that had once echoed with my family's cruelty now stood as proof that legacy could evolve beyond its origins. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all pressed against me, the long nights, the unending decisions, the quiet ache of missing the people who would never stand here to see it. One evening I stayed at the lab long after everyone left. The sky outside dimmed into deep violet, the first stars flickering through thin clouds. I walked through the corridors slowly, touching the edges of the work tables, the cool metal of the door frames. In the conference room, Walter's portrait hung beside a new one of Ruth, two faces that anchored everything I'd built. I whispered a soft thank you to them both, knowing it was their faith that had brought me this far. The following morning, an email arrived that would change everything. It came from the National Agricultural Foundation, the same organization David Rains had introduced us to the year before. They'd selected Pine Ridge as a recipient of a national grant for innovation in sustainable farming. Alongside the funding came an invitation to present our research in Washington, D.C. The thought of it filled me with both excitement and fear. For so long my work had been about the quiet corners of this land, the sound of wind through the fields, the slow pulse of growth beneath the soil. Now it would be seen on a stage where my grandfather's name would echo alongside mine. When I told the team, the room filled with cheers. Micah grinned and said, "Guess we'll need to find you something other than jeans for the presentation." Even Tara, usually so composed, hugged me tight. "He'd be proud," she whispered. I knew exactly who she meant. The weeks leading up to the trip passed quickly. Between preparations, Madison and I finalized the last details of the summer camp graduation. The children had built a small exhibit of their work charts, drawings, models of irrigation systems. The night before the ceremony, I stood alone in the greenhouse, looking at the rows of plants under soft light. The air was thick with warmth and the scent of tomato vines. I thought of Ruth's words about planting, even when the soil felt empty, and realized she had prepared me for this moment long before I understood it. The next morning, the ceremony began under a wide blue sky. Parents filled the open courtyard, and the children took turns presenting their projects. One of them, a shy girl named Lacey, handed me a small notebook. "I started tracking bees in our orchard," she said proudly. "We lost some hives last year, but they're coming back." Inside the notebook were pages of careful observations, handwriting that reminded me of my own at her age. I felt my throat tighten as I thanked her. "Keep going," I told her. "You're doing exactly what the world needs." After the applause faded and the families departed, Madison stood beside me, her eyes shining. "You've turned grief into something that breathes," she said quietly. I looked out at the field where children's footprints trailed through the dust, the laughter still echoing faintly. "Maybe we both did," I said. Later that evening, as the sun sank low, I packed my notes for the trip to Washington. The sound of the crickets outside blended with the hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of Walter's pocket watch on my desk. I held it in my hand for a moment, feeling the smooth silver against my palm. Inside, his words were still clear. "My little scientist will change the world someday." The flight to Washington was early. As the plane lifted, I looked out over the patchwork of farmland, below fields glowing gold in the first light rivers, twisting like ribbons between them. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace. Not the fragile kind that follows loss, but the steady kind that grows from understanding where you came from and who helped you get there. The presentation went better than I could have hoped. I spoke of Walter's dream, Ruth's resilience, and the quiet miracle of soil regeneration that began right here in Texas. When I finished, the room was still for a heartbeat before filling with applause. Later, one of the judges approached me. "You've built something extraordinary," she said. "But more than that, you've built continuity. That's rare." I thanked her, though the words felt too small for the moment. When I returned home, Madison and the team were waiting at the gate, waving from the porch. Tara had baked a pie, and Micah had strung lights along the fence. The lab glowed like a beacon against the night. As I stepped out of the car, Madison handed me a small envelope. "This came while you were gone," she said. It was from the foundation, a follow-up letter confirming a second round of funding and a proposal to name Pine Ridge as a model for national study. I looked up at the house, the fields, the familiar skyline stretching around me. "He'd say, 'We're just getting started,'" I murmured. That night, after everyone left, I walked to the far edge of the property where Ruth was buried beneath the old oak tree. Fireflies moved through the tall grass, their light flickering like memories. I knelt down, pressing my hand to the cool earth. "We did it," I whispered. "It's growing just like you said." The wind shifted gently, carrying the faint scent of cedar and rain. I stayed there for a while, listening to the rhythm of the night, feeling more connected to the land than ever before. When I finally turned back toward the house, the porch light flickered on automatically, a soft welcome in the dark. The lab lights shimmered behind it, bright and steady, like the heartbeat of everything Walter and Ruth had believed in. The path ahead was still wide and unknown, but I was no longer walking it alone. The foundation had grown into people, into purpose, into something enduring. And as I crossed the field, the watch in my pocket ticking softly, I knew that this was what legacy was meant to feel like, not an inheritance, but a continuation. The morning after I visited Ruth's grave, the world felt different, quieter, lighter somehow. The sun rose over the fields in a soft gold haze, the air thick with the scent of dew and earth. From the porch, I could see the greenhouses glowing faintly in the distance, their windows catching the light like mirrors. For the first time in years, I didn't wake with a list in my head or a weight on my chest. There was still work to do, there always would be, but the work no longer felt like a fight. It felt like belonging. Madison joined me on the porch that morning, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. She'd stayed the night after our gathering at the lab. Her hair was loose, her eyes tired but peaceful. "You're up early," she said, handing me a mug. I smiled. Old habits. We sat in silence for a while, watching the fields come alive with movement, the wind pushing through the grass, a hawk circling high above. It was the same land we'd both grown up on, but it didn't carry the same ghosts anymore. Somehow, we'd outlasted them. Later that week, we hosted a small memorial for Ruth and Walter at the Innovation Center. We planted 2 young oaks by the main walkway, one for each of them. As the soil covered the roots, I thought about how far we'd come from that day in the lawyer's office, the bitterness, the lies, the way my family fractured beneath its own greed. Now, all that remained was truth, and the quiet kind of love that doesn't need words to prove itself. Madison stood beside me, her hand brushing mine as she whispered, "They'd be proud." I nodded, my throat tight. They already are. The following months brought more growth than I could have imagined. The foundation named Pine Ridge a national model for sustainable innovation. We expanded our education program, offering scholarships for students who reminded me of the girl I used to be, curious, uncertain, but full of possibility. When I watched them walk through the labs, wide-eyed and excited, I saw glimpses of my younger self, the one who had once felt small and invisible. It was strange and beautiful seeing that version of me finally given the space she'd always deserved. Madison became a steady part of the center's rhythm. She taught communication workshops, helped the students present their projects, and even started a mentorship program for women entering agriculture and environmental studies. The walls that had once divided us had softened into something resembling sisterhood. One afternoon, as we walked through the fields, she turned to me with a thoughtful smile. "You know," she said, "I used to think legacy was about what you left behind. But watching this place, I think it's about who you bring forward." I didn't answer right away, just looked out over the rows of crops stretching toward the horizon. "Then we're doing it right," I said finally. Every evening, I made a point to stop by the old ranch house before heading home. It still stood sturdy and weathered, the porch swing creaking just as it always had. I kept it exactly as Ruth left it, the lace curtains, the smell of cedar, even her favorite teacup by the window. I wasn't holding on to the past. I was keeping it alive in the right way. One night I sat at her old kitchen table with Walter's pocket watch resting beside my notebook. The ticking was steady, comforting. I thought about the man who'd taught me to love questions more than answers, and the woman who'd taught me that truth was a form of mercy. Between them, they'd left me the tools to build a life that was entirely my own. In the fall, we opened a new building on the property, a research wing dedicated to community-driven climate solutions. The plaque by the entrance read, "The Hart Annex, built in memory of Walter and Ruth Hart, for the dreamers who never stopped asking why." As the ribbon was cut and applause filled the air, I caught sight of the watch chain glinting in my pocket. For a moment, I could almost hear Walter's laugh carried by the wind. It was the kind of sound that stayed with you light, but lasting. That evening after the celebration ended and everyone went home, I walked out to the oak trees we'd planted for them. The air was cool, the stars sharp and bright. I sat on the bench between the trees and listened to the quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when life finally finds its balance. I thought about everything that had brought me here, the betrayal, the loneliness, the long road back to peace, and realized something I hadn't understood before. Justice isn't always a courtroom or a confrontation. Sometimes it's simply living well after you were told you couldn't. It's turning pain into purpose, silence into growth, and loss into legacy. I stayed there until the night grew deep, the wind rustling gently through the branches overhead. When I finally stood to leave, I looked back once more at the trees, their leaves trembling in the moonlight. "Thank you," I whispered, not just to them, but to everything that had shaped me into the woman I'd become. As I walked back toward the house, the lights from the lab glowed softly in the distance, the hum of the generators steady as a heartbeat. The world I'd inherited was still imperfect, still changing, but it was alive, and that was enough. Before I go, I'll say this: hold on to the people who believe in you, even when you've forgotten how to believe in yourself. Build something good from what hurt you. And when you finally find your peace, don't be afraid to share it. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect or share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Sometimes a single story can remind us we all have the power to turn what we're given into something that lasts.